event. So we can, if you share any information, we'll be able to have a record of it. So before we get started, I just was going to introduce the staff who are here tonight. Aline Tanillian is here, who is a planner who works with me in the Community Development Agency on housing and federal grants issues. Leslie Lako is a senior planner also in the Community Development Agency. You'll hear from her later about the safety element. Edgardo Vasquez is here with us, also a planner on my team, and he was helping with our tech tonight. So thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, are you, Aline, can you share the presentation?
Yeah, and then
I was just going to say, sorry, the translation. Yes, please. Sorry. Go ahead, Aline.
Yeah, so para interpretación en español, seleccione el icono del globo del mundo para elegir el idioma que desea escuchar para esta reunión.
So just to note, we have translation services in Spanish, and that's available at the bottom of the page. So let's go to the next slide, please. So our agenda tonight, we're going to review what a housing element is. So some of you who may have been here before, this might be repetitive, but we want to make sure that everybody is starting at the same place. We're going to share some information that we got from the state. We submitted our draft housing element to the state, and we got some comments back that we'll go over with you. And then we're going to talk about some changes to the county-wide plan and the development code that we're proposing in order to implement the housing element. And then Leslie's going to talk about the safety element and some changes in our development code that we're proposing to implement that. And then we'll talk about some next steps and other opportunities for you to have your voice heard in this process. And then we'll save some time at the end to answer your questions. In the meantime, if you want to use the chat for just quick questions or clarification, then we'll be answering the chat during the presentation, and then we'll answer questions in more detail at the end. Next slide, please. Great. So let's, so before we go through that, we're going to, I'll hand it over to Aline, who's going to give a high level overview of the housing element.
Thank you, Lily. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight and for your interest in this process. So these few slides will be a refresher for those of you that have heard this before and an overview for those that this is new. So the housing element is updated every 8 years, and it's a component of the general plan. And in the county, that's called the county-wide plan, which is essentially the blueprint vision for the future of unincorporated Marin. This section of the county-wide plan, the housing element, is required to be reviewed by the state through the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is also known as HCD. We have an adoption deadline at the end of January of next year, so January 31st of 2023. And the housing element we're going to discuss tonight is related to the unincorporated areas of the county. Each individual jurisdiction is required to complete their own housing element. And then just to contextualize it a bit more, we have within our housing element a unit goal for the 8-year cycle of about 3,569 new units, and it's about 14,000 units for the county as a whole. This slide provides an overview of the major components of the housing element, beginning to the left with the needs assessment. This section essentially analyzes and reviews demographic trends in the community, in addition to housing market trends and the needs of special needs groups. The next section is a newer section to the housing element. It's called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which is also known as AFFH. This requires us to review the housing element from the fair housing lens to ensure that the selected housing sites really advance fair housing choices for all and that the programs and policies also support fair housing and what's at the bottom, the last bullet in this box, meaningful actions. So to really bring forward actions that are going to really address this issue. The next box is the sites inventory. This is the aspect of the housing element that receives a lot of attention. It's the location of sites for housing across all the income levels that are noted here, from very low through above moderate income housing. And then last but not least, we have the programs and policies section of the housing element, which is essentially the implementation program for the housing element. Some of the programs are required to be aligned with state law, which includes by right zoning policy. Lily is going to go into this a little bit later in the presentation. You may have heard this term before. It essentially applies to sites that have been identified in previous housing element cycles by the county and would streamline development. The next section here is programs to incentivize affordable housing production. And we must also look at programs to streamline county development timelines as well. This map may be familiar to most of you. This is an overview of the candidate housing sites that have been identified in the housing element. And as you can see, there are virtually sites across all areas of unincorporated Marin, again, with the goal to advance fair housing choices for all residents in our county. We also wanted to provide just a quick overview of the consequences of non-compliance of the housing element. You may have heard that HCD, the state, has what's called the Housing Accountability Unit. This is a new unit at the state level that is tasked with reviewing jurisdictions to ensure that jurisdictions are accountable for the submittal of their housing element in addition to the actual implementation of the housing element. So they'll be monitoring how housing elements get implemented across the next 8-year cycles. Another consequence here is losing access to funding opportunities such as road and transportation funds. It also creates the risk of losing access to housing funds like permanent local housing allocation and other matching dollars that the county has received to date. Another consequence is the possibility of a lawsuit from the state, which the state has recently done in Southern California, like in Huntington Beach. Would also require the jurisdiction to update the housing element every 4 years as opposed to 8 years, in addition to the responsibility to plan for more housing units, additional housing units. This slide provides a high-level overview of the timeline of the project. We are currently in the 5th bubble, so the middle bottom bubble. We just received our comment letter from the state a couple of weeks ago. Lily's going to go into more specifics about what the comments were in the next section of the presentation. And we're now preparing for winter to bring forward consideration to the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors for final approval in January of next year. So now I'll pass it off to Lily, who will provide an overview of the comments we received from HCD.
Thank you, Aline. So as Aline mentioned, we had the draft of the housing element was available for public review during the month of June. We received over 140 comments, which were then incorporated into the draft that was submitted to the state for their statutory 90-day review. And we got their comments back on October 17th. Next slide, please. So before we go into them, we have been monitoring other Bay Area cities, towns, and counties who have submitted before us and have been kind of watching their comments very closely to see kind of what types of things the state was commenting on theirs. And many of them, because it's a new component, a new part of the housing element, there was a lot of missing information in that affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement that Aline talked about. And often the actions, that analysis requires that you look at those fair housing issues in your community, and then you tie them to programs and policies so that there's a through line between them. And many of our Bay Area communities have not done that. We were really pleased with the fact that our comments were really just about adding some additional information, but we're strong in that area. Another common thread is with other Bay Area letters that have been received was lack of outreach and public participation. So there's a new, the requirement this time is much more robust, particularly when you're doing your affirmatively furthering fair housing work, is that you're reaching out to communities who are typically not part of that conversation. And we didn't get any comments on our public outreach, so we were pleased with that. And then often there's extensive comments on sites and lack of concrete actions in programs. So those are kind of the common themes that we've seen. Let's go to the next slide, please. We had comments in 4 main areas. The first was on the needs assessment that Aline talked about, where we're really looking at our own local community's needs and some of the examples that we needed to provide additional data. For example, on our populations of people who are experiencing homelessness, we had demographic information, but we really needed to look at local trends and then tie those more to actions. In the constraint section, for example, we need to do some more analysis around the fees and the fee structure, particularly among agencies that are not the county's agencies, and how those fees might impact or impede housing development. And then in our resources or sites section, we need to do some more analysis to show, for example, how we arrived at the realistic capacity on a site. So when you show where you can develop housing, one of the things you have to do is decide how you arrived at that number, what is realistic, what's feasible based on development trends in your community. And as many of us know, there's not a lot of those examples in the unincorporated county. So we've looked at surrounding jurisdictions as well as surrounding cities and towns, as well as surrounding neighboring counties to get some examples. And in our policies and programs, there was a few of them that we needed to add some more information, for example, around our accessory dwelling unit or ADU program. We needed to add information about how we're going to monitor that program, and if there's any barriers that we identify during the planning cycle, that we address those, as well as monitoring affordability and adding some more specificity, and working closely with our water district was another recommendation in our policies and programs section. But overall, I would say that the theme of our comments was that they were there's some additional analysis, and it's doable for us within and still meet the statutory deadline. So that was a really positive news for us. Let's go to the next slide, please, Aline. So the next section that I want to talk about is the countywide plan and development code amendments that we are proposing. And they are needed for us to be able to accommodate that regional housing need number that Aline talked about, and to align with new state laws. It seems like every year there's new housing laws that are passed, and so we have to align our countywide plan and development code with those new state requirements. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the countywide plan It creates the long-term vision for unincorporated county, how we're going to develop over time. Our countywide plan was first adopted in 1974 and was last updated in 2007. There's 3 main sections. The first is the natural systems and agricultural element, which is where the safety element will be incorporated. And Leslie will be talking about that next. The built environment, which is where the housing element that we're working on now will be incorporated. And then there's the socioeconomic element. And thank you. The development code implements that vision that's established in the countywide plan. It includes zoning designations, development standards, and processing regulations. So there's also some changes that we'll be talking about there. Next slide, please. So we're making these changes, as I mentioned, to ensure access to fair housing, to reduce barriers that are within those documents to multi-unit development, to comply with state laws, and to accomplish our regional housing need, our share of the regional housing need allocation, as well as to address some special needs that were identified in that needs assessment. Next slide, please. So there's a number of policies that we are recommending to the Board and Planning Commission for elimination. The first, limited development to the lowest end of the density range in certain areas of the county, including the Bayland corridor and anywhere that was on septic or wells. And in order to meet that higher arena that we have this time, we're recommending to eliminate that program. Although, just to note, we're not recommending that we would eliminate other protections of environmental protections. It would just that restriction on only developing at the lowest end of the density range. Also recommending removing a policy that encouraged that limited development to the low end of the density range in urbanized areas. So it's kind of counterintuitive. So we had a policy that said that any areas that were next to a city or town had to develop at the lowest end of the density range. And it was intended to encourage annexation, but that isn't really happening in Marin. There's very little annexation between the county and cities and towns. And so we're recommending, just from a good planning perspective and in order to meet that higher number of homes that we need to plan for, to eliminate that program also. Next slide, please. We have 2 kind of larger regional sites that the Board and Planning Commission have selected for adding additional housing, including St. Vincent's. And we've identified about 40 acres on that site that are outside of sea level rise or other environmentally sensitive resources where additional development could happen. So there's some changes to the St. Vincent's policies to accommodate that. And then the Silvera site, which has a Williamson Act, which protects it as ag land, there's no changes recommended to that portion of the site. Next slide, please. There's also a portion of the property that's owned by the Buck Center, which is in unincorporated Novato, and that we're proposing as a regional site. And to accommodate that, we have the countywide plan includes corridors. So there's the city center corridor, the inland rural corridor, and the coastal corridor, as well as the Baylands corridor. And the city center corridor is really where we're concentrating most of our higher density development. And so this recommendation is to move that corridor or move that site so that it's not in the inland rural corridor, so it's in the city center corridor, to more accurately match the type of development that's around it. It's next to the city of Novato, the freeway, and other kind of commercial development. Next slide, please. There's some changes recommended to community plans. Currently, community plans set the goals, objectives, policies, and programs for specific communities. However, some of them are inconsistent with state law and have the effect of limiting multi-unit housing. There's a policy that says that if there's a policy, or if there's a policy in a countywide, in a community plan that's more restrictive than the rest of the countywide plan, that it governs. And so one of the recommendation is to have the countywide plan that is related to land use, densities, and floor area ratios to govern rather than a community plan. And again, that's to align those more closely with state law that is intended to encourage multi-unit housing. Next slide, please. So one of the requirements that we also need to accommodate in our development code changes is the state's default density. And in order for a site to be to accommodate lower income housing, affordable housing, it needs to be zoned at least 20 units an acre. And I'm sorry, this gets a little bit wonky, but I want to make sure that everybody's clear on kind of what these terms that we use are. So that default density is used as a proxy for kind of feasibility for affordable housing. So because land is so expensive, you need to develop it at a higher density to make it pencil out. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is rezoning some sites to the default density in order to meet those lower income unit requirements. Next slide, please. And Aline mentioned by right. So some of the sites that we have currently in our housing element, if they have been used in two different housing elements and they still haven't developed, in order to reuse that site in your next housing element, you need to make it what's called by right. And what that means is you don't go through the typical discretionary approval process. Instead, you just have to demonstrate that you meet objective design standards. So, you know, like height or parking spaces or things that can be easily measured. And this is really intended to address when there's many hearings. You know, there's a senior housing development in one of our towns that they had 13 public hearings be required for that process to get approved. And so this kind of policy by the state is intended to address those kind of situations where there's many hearings, which can be expensive and delay a project. Next slide, please. And then we'll also be recommending rezoning a portion of some of our larger sites in order to accommodate that housing at a higher density, as we've talked about. We won't be rezoning necessarily the whole site. If they're larger sites, we'll be just doing a portion of it that is outside of environmentally sensitive areas, that has access to infrastructure and roadways. So that will be part of the recommendation that goes to the Board and Planning Commission. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to go through the safety element. Just to remind you, if you have questions, if we're not clear on anything, please drop them in the chat. And then when we're done, we'll be able to unmute yourself and ask questions. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you. So the safety element is also part of the countywide plan. It's where the programs and policies on public safety reside. And it's really, in Marin County, it's really focused very much on environmental hazards. Next slide. We're updating the safety element alongside the housing element. And one of the benefits of doing that is that it makes housing safer. The policies in the safety element will generally improve conditions in Marin County to make it safer, which makes housing safer. But the policies and programs also specify development requirements so that new housing is constructed more safely. And then finally, the safety element contains programs and policies for equitable protection from climate change hazards, which also has the effect of making the county generally safer for all. Next slide. There are new state requirements to update this safety element every 8 years alongside the housing element. So this kicks off our first in that series of 8 years, 8-year cycles, I should say. The county hasn't really had a safety element per se. We've had a lot of programs and policies spread throughout the countywide plan. So this is a new move for us. The update is required to focus on climate change, adaptation, and resilience. And as part of that, the first step in the process is to assess the county's vulnerability to climate change impacts, the range of climate change impacts. So we did that. We prepared a vulnerability assessment that was about a year ago, and we did present that at public meetings. And one of the key findings in the vulnerability assessment was that there are some populations that are much more vulnerable to climate change impacts than others. And so the draft safety element really emphasizes equity and the needs of vulnerable communities, along with the other programs and policies related to climate change impacts. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we had programs and policies spread throughout our countywide plan previously. Those focused on geologic hazards and flooding and wildfire. And now we have some new policy areas, and these are all consolidated in the new environmental hazards and safety element for our countywide plan. The first new policy area relates to equity. The second is a more robust wildfire section that really addresses the climate change, how climate change has exacerbated the threat from wildfires. We have a new section on disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And then a new climate adaptation and resiliency section where we address sea level rise, severe weather, extreme heat, and drought. Next slide. As part of one of the programs does require us to amend the Bayfront Conservation Combining District to address sea level rise along the Bay shoreline. This is part of our development code, and it's a combining district, so it combines with other zoning designations. And the purpose of it is to protect habitat and protect public safety and also protect public views. So the amendment that we're proposing is really focused on protection of people, property, and habitat from sea level rise. Go ahead, next slide. So the Bayfront Conservation Combining District is shown here on this map in gold. You can see it doesn't cover the entire shoreline. It only covers those unincorporated areas of Marin County that are along the shoreline. Now, also on this map is these blue hatched areas, and they represent 3.3 feet of sea level rise. We're targeting our amendment in the areas where the blue hatched 3.3 feet of sea level rise intersects with the Bayfront Conservation Combining District in gold. So in some areas, that's the entire Bayfront Conservation Combining District, and in others, it's only a portion of it. But it's where they intersect that we're focused. Next slide. So we're amending the Bayfront Conservation Combining District, otherwise known as the BFC, and a little easier to say, by identifying a specific sea level rise scenario, which we've identified as 3.3 feet of sea level rise. We chose that because it's consistent with this current state guidance. And we have a new program in our draft safety element that requires us to be consistent with state guidance on our sea level rise scenarios. The best place to be specific about that is in the development code, which gets updated more frequently than the countywide plan. So that's how we came to 3.3 feet of sea level rise. The amendment also will require the siting of new and habitable development only to be upland and as high as possible to be protected from sea level rise inundation. It also will require, where a shoreline protection project is proposed, that nature-based measures be assessed, and only if they're found infeasible would we permit hard shoreline protection measures. So that would be like a seawall. And that's because there are adverse environmental impacts associated with hard shoreline armoring. And then finally, the amendment requires a disclosure of the risk and liability associated with new development in a sea level rise inundation area. So that's where we're at with the safety element update. We sent the safety element out for public review on June 1st of this year. We also sent it to the Board of Forestry, and the Board of Forestry is the board that oversees CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE has to review and approve the safety elements. That's also a new state requirement. So we sent that out to them June 2nd. We received, after some back and forth, we received approval from the Board of Forestry on September 22nd this year. And we came back to the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission on October 11th with some changes based on the CAL FIRE review. And now we are coming back to the public. So here we are, and that's where we're at in the process. I'll give it back to the housing team now.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. So our next steps are to make some changes, which we are primarily, we're almost done with those from the HCD comments. We actually met with staff from the state this morning to go through some of the recommendations and got some direction from them. We have a meeting with the Board of Supervisors on December 6th to review any changes that we need to make to the sites list, just based on, updated information since the last time they reviewed that. And then we'll be preparing the public draft for adoption. Next slide, please. And the environmental review is currently, the draft of environmental review document is currently out for public review and comment. The Board and Planning Commission are holding a joint workshop to receive public comment. And just note, it's on a Wednesday, November 16th. It's not the normal board date. It was just got a little crowded this time of year. So they're holding it at 5 o'clock on November 16th, next Wednesday. We have a meeting with First Five where we're going to talk about kind of what's happening, what happens after adoption, with a focus on implementing our programs and policies. So we'll have that conversation on November 17th. On all these are available on our website. We have these community workshops that we're doing, just a repeat of this one tonight. But if anybody is interested and missed this one, we have one more on the 10th. And they're all 6 to 7, and there's more information about these on our website if anyone's interested. So that concludes our presentation, and now we'll go to questions and comments. It looks like, Aline, there's a couple in the chat. Maybe we'll start there.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lily. And others you can use your virtual raise hand feature or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question verbally, and then we'll get to you right afterwards. But there's a question here. If we can further discuss by what climate hazards are and how these hazards will be addressed. Leslie.
Okay, so the climate hazards are both existing hazards that will be exacerbated by climate change. So wildfires is really a great example of that. We've seen what's happening with wildfires in the state already. But flooding and sea level rise is another example. So there's also a few new impacts that we would expect to see with climate change. One of those being extreme heat days in Marin County. So we have new programs and policies related to each of those hazards. As an example, we have a new program that requires cooling centers be available during high heat days. I'm not really sure that I can expand any further without going into a lot of programs and policies, but I think I've answered your question.
And if they have more questions, I'll drop your email in the chat. There's also the safety element email, safetyelement@marincounty.org, if there are any other specific questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like the next question here is also related to the safety element. 3.3 feet of sea level rise over what period of time? So the state guidance is 3.3 feet of sea level rise by mid-century, so about 2050 to 2060. And does the safety element influence the build element, i.e. in a floodplain? Zoning is restricted and/or allocation of building. I'm not sure that I understand that question. So Al Scotch, if you're available to be on mic and explain the question, that would be really helpful.
And I would just add, while we're doing that, I think we'll go to some of the raised hand questions, but I just would point out that the safety element did inform the housing element in, where housing would go, or whether if there was, when I talked about St. Vincent's, for example, we looked at sea level rise as a impact on that site and ensured that anywhere that we are proposing housing was outside of that. Also, we looked at whether there was any issues that needed to be mitigated if they were, subject to some, increased hazards based on climate change.
So is there
Thanks.
can you hear me?
Yes, thank
Yes.
you.
Oh, so is there any specific areas that have been affected by the safety element other than St. Vincent's? I mean, is there specific rules for flood zones, for instance, that have changed because of the safety element being introduced?
Oh, I see. That's a good question. There aren't any specific rules in the flood hazard zones that have been changed as a result of the safety element. There is some overlap between that area covered by the Bayfront Conservation Combining District and flood zones. But they're actually different permit processes that apply there. So while you might be required, while a new development might be required to, say, be elevated in the Bayfront Conservation Combining District, if it's also in a certain type of flood zone, it would be required to be elevated through FEMA anyways. But that would be sort of a stricter type of elevation, and there are stricter rules that the Department of Public Works would require.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. So I'll pass it off to Liz and then Riley and then Michael.
Great, thank you. Lily, thank you for your presentation, and to the staff, very conscientious. I appreciate it. I live in San Anselmo. I'm on San Francisco Boulevard, very close to the unincorporated section 404 San Francisco Boulevard, which there's been some different information being passed around that it might be being rezoned from an R1 single family of 4 homes to a multi-unit of 64 homes or 64 dwellings. And so just wondering about that, and how your committee works on things like density increase caps, how it would affect the neighborhood, because that would be quite a bit more traffic on San Francisco Boulevard. Oh, I think you're on mute. I'll mute myself.
Unmuted myself and then I muted myself back. Sorry. So yes, the site that you're talking about on San Anselmo 404 is located in the unincorporated part of San Anselmo, and it's proposed to be rezoned to accommodate more housing. There's, as you know, there's existing multifamily housing there. I think it's legal non-conforming, which means that it was developed kind of before the zoning that's in place there now was adopted. So there's existing housing there, and there's a developer who has been seeking development on that site. So there have been conversations with the city around the town of San Anselmo around annexation. But yes, we are proposing for that site to be rezoned, as we are, if you'll remember that map that Aline pulled up, there's housing throughout the unincorporated parts of the county. So given the fact that our regional housing need went from 185 to 3,500 to over 3,500, we really needed to look at all parts of our community. So, and to align with our goals of fair housing goals, which means that we wanted to make sure that particularly housing that was zoned for lower income are in those good schools and in areas of opportunity. That said, there will be impacts on the community, just like there is when there's any changes. So if there were traffic mitigations that needed to happen, that would be part of a development proposal that came through. So as you know, our environmental review is a program environmental review, so it looks at things at a very high level. But then once a development project came through, then one of the things that we would be looking at would be those type of things that you're talking about, impacts on the community, whether there is infrastructure to support it, access to water, sanitary services, etc. So that's part of any development proposal that comes through.
Okay, so in cases like this where it would go from 20 units to 64, would this be a situation where you'd have by right process, zoning policy, or would there be time for public comment?
I don't believe that site wasn't previously on a housing element, so it wouldn't be required to be by right. I don't believe that we're proposing that to be by right, but that is something that we are going to be finalizing. We have a group of consultants who are working with us, and that's actually due back to me, that list of any site that would be by right, so that we will make sure to share that with everybody. But at this point, I don't believe that site would be proposed as by right, because it wasn't used in a previous housing element.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Riley, and then Michael.
Yes, good evening. My name is Riley Hurd, and I wanted to make a brief comment about the San Domenico property, which is part of the Central Marin zone, and specifically that there's a really good opportunity there for teacher housing, and it's a bit counterintuitive, and I could see how perhaps an outside environmental consultant or EIR preparer might look at that site and find it remote from other uses. But I think it's really important that we start getting teachers living, A, just in the county where they work, but B, as close to the schools as possible. And so when I took a look at the EIR for the housing element, there was an alternative that purported to reduce the vehicle miles traveled for certain sites. And it suggested removing the San Domenico property. And again, I get if you just kind of look at a map, it's a little bit of a distance from any particular downtown core, but that's actually completely counterintuitive to VMT if you think of this as potential teacher housing. Otherwise, the teachers need to drive up and down Butterfield, which objectively isn't ideal, and they'll actually be driving much, much further. So the comment I wanted to lodge for the county was, I don't think it's right to think of removing the San Domenico housing site as reducing VMT. And I'd strongly encourage you to keep that property on the list, let teachers live in Marin, and let them live close to where they work. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I also would encourage you to submit it through the environmental review process. I also just would make note that another one of our sites, which is actually an unincorporated Larkspur, and it's on state-owned surplus land. Part of that site is being used for teacher and staff housing. And our Board of Supervisors approved the structure of a joint powers authority between the county and the school district and a developer to do that. And so I think that there's good examples of ways that we could encourage and facilitate teacher housing for staff and teachers in our community. So I think that that's a really useful point, and I know that it impacts a lot of our teachers are commuting from out of the county. When there was those North Bay fires, my kids' school closed down because so many teachers were commuting from outside of the county, and they're there. So that's a important point. Thank you. Michael
Anderson, thank you so far for your good work. I have a specific couple of questions about 404 San Francisco Boulevard. If this all goes through, where does the number that MIG suggested, 64 units on that property, is that based on 20 units per acre, 30 units per acre?
It's based on, yes, that default density, and I'll have to look up and get back to you about that specific site. I can't remember if that one is 20 or 30. I used to know all of our sites so well, but there's so many now that I don't have them all memorized, but I'll get back to you on that. It's also looking at development capacity. So we looked at making sure that, there's a creek that runs right behind there, that process is, that is, not subject to flooding, that is outside of that stream side setback. It's not on the hill, which is pretty steep. So it's really clustering it there. And then we also have to, given that there's already homes there, that you also have to factor that in. So it's really based on that combination of development capacity and then at least the default density. And I can get back to you about what that site is zoned.
Thank you.
Whether it's
And
proposed at 20 or 30.
If it is zoned for 64 units, does that enable the developer to build that many, or it's still subject to mitigating factors?
So the goal of the housing element is really to, if you put a site on your housing element with a certain development capacity, you really shouldn't, it really should be able to accommodate that. That's what the state requirement is. That said, we don't have all the information. We haven't done a detailed analysis. We've done a kind of a higher level analysis of each site. And if there was something that made it, you know, so that development couldn't happen at that density, or if a developer came in with a lower density, that's also possible. So, you know, I would say the goal really is to establish that is what the density could be in the housing element, but a developer is not required to develop at that density. They could typically propose a development with fewer units.
A final clarification. It's public knowledge that the developer intends to annex the property into the town of San Anselmo. Why would the county burden itself with examining that issue now, and or simply wait for the town to take over? It confuses me.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we have a couple of sites that we are proposing housing on that are within the sphere of influence of a city or town. And that is what you would expect, because you really would want to put your development next to a town where there's services, right? We don't want to put, you know, our higher density housing off in somewhere that doesn't have access to transit or schools, et cetera. So several of our sites are in that same situation. And if the county is the one who has it in our housing element and we take it through the entitlement process, then the county is the one who gets the credit under the RENA. And there can be an agreement between a county and a city around sharing it, depending on the timing. But typically, if the county is the one who is doing the zoning and the entitlements, then we would get credit. And there's some more details that go into that process, but that's how it typically works.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we go to some of the chat questions and then come back to the in-person
we
ones?
do have Nancy.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to maybe answer that because we couldn't answer the others later.
Thanks. Thank you for doing this for us. This is very nice for us to be able to get things clearer. I'm also on San Francisco Boulevard, and what I think is really smart of what you all have done is put a lot of these additional places near freeway access. The thing is, our street only has one way in, and you have to go back out the same way. It's a long way to the freeway, and that's very burdensome. I think it's wonderful that you have most of them near the freeway. That looks really good, because that's easy access. We already have a bottleneck as it is, so just something to think about.
Thanks for that comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And I'm seeing a couple questions here I'm going to read out. So are there instances where inconsistencies between the proposed housing element and existing specific plans have been identified? And if so, how are they addressed?
So I think that there's 22 of them. So I'm not super intimately familiar with all of them, but I do know that we have, for example, one of our community plans really is restrictive around multi-unit development in the core of that community. And so in order for us to have a housing element site in that community, that's a policy that we have to address. So that's an example where our policy is really, many of our communities, as we know, are primarily single unit development. And there's a long history to that. And that's what our development pattern has been. Sometimes there's policies that reinforce that were based on restrictive zoning and segregationist policies. And so those are the kind of things that we have to address in the housing element. And when there's, for example, the restrictive covenants that are on many of our homes, including my own home that was built in 1959, has one of those restrictive covenants that says that I can't sell my home to a person of color, which of course is illegal, inconsistent with both state and federal law, but it is still there on the books. And so those kind of policies that have the impact of restricting access to housing or a variety of housing types are the type of things that we have to address that are in some of our community plans.
Thanks, Lily. There's a question here about water. In spite of today's rain, we're in the worst drought in history and it may well be permanent. There's not enough water for the current population. And I don't see anything in these plans that addresses how all these thousands of new houses will get their water.
Water is that's a really good point. And I'm surprised that we hadn't talked about it earlier in this meeting. It's usually something that comes up frequently, and I should have brought it up myself. One of the things that we'll have to be adapting to with climate change, I think, is this idea is that we'll have, ongoing droughts, but also really intense rain and then periods of drought. So that said, the state has said that regardless of the drought status that we all are in, and this is something that's not unique to us, right? California and the West as a whole are experiencing droughts, that we still have an obligation of planning housing. And there's a few things that we have to do that. We have to look at programs and policies around water. That could, if there's funding available, either through the state or the federal government, is there ways that we could expand storage of water? And I was, met with some of our water providers, and they were expecting that as we have these kind of really heavy rain sometimes, and then lack of rain, we need to increase our water storage so that during those intense rains, we can, we have a way of storing that water and saving it. Another thing that we need to do is looking at better ways of recycling our water. In Southern California, they do much better jobs. The Bay Area is really behind the times as far as doing recycled water and being much more efficient with it. Most of our really fresh drinking water goes on the ground for landscaping, and we really should do a better job around recycling that. Again, that's going to take money to have better recycling, the purple pipes and other infrastructure for that. So that's another thing that we have to look at. And, the final thing I would say is that under state law, if we get to the point where new water connections are rationed, then developments that have a high percentage of affordable housing go to the front of the line. And those are all things that we have to take into consideration as we're planning for new housing.
Thanks, Lily. I think we're at time, so I'm just going to read our last question. I see a comment and then a question here around the Oak Hill project in San Quentin, Larkspur. The question is whether it will be counted for the county, if the housing credits will be counted for the county or Larkspur.
So that's a good question. We have submitted our draft housing element to the state for review, and it was inclusive of that site. And we'll be having conversations. Larkspur has not yet prepared a draft housing element, but we'll be having conversations about that if they're interested in pursuing that site. But it's currently on the draft for the county, and we've counted those units in the unincorporated county.
Great, thanks, Lily. I'm not seeing any other questions.
All right, just thank you all for being here. Happy election night. Hopefully happy election night to each of you. We appreciate your time. If you have other questions that come up, please reach out. You can go to our website. There's an email address right there. Also, you can subscribe to that webpage and you'll get any updates if there's any hearings. And we really appreciate your thoughtful comments and your time. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.